Welcome back to the Ultimate Mixdown. In this video, I wanted to take a step back from the software and talk about what mixing is and what makes a great mix. Once you understand the principles I'm about to discuss in this video, it won't seem like mixing is some magical process behind closed doors, but rather you'll see it as a series of small and precise steps that help bring balance, clarity, and even enhance the emotion of your mixes. In this video, we'll go through the 5 major tools used in the mixing process by professionals today. And be sure to stick around to the end for a little bonus and a link to my free 7 Steps to a Pro Mix guide. Let's dive right in. Alright, so what is mixing? At its very core, mixing is adjusting the levels of all the instruments and parts in your song so that everything can be heard. But obviously, that's not just what mixing is. A huge part of mixing is making sure that you can hear them clearly, and then also adding the human element or the emotion to it, and you can use your mixing skills to invoke certain emotions during different parts of the song. There are many tools that will help you with mixing, and understanding the tools and what you can accomplish with them, as well as knowing when to use them and when not to use them, will help you achieve great sounding mixes. So the first tool everyone's heard of, and that's volume, adjusting the levels of each track and each part, and making sure that the focal pieces are louder than the backing pieces, and making sure that everything can be heard, no matter how subtle it is. So with that, think of your favorite modern pop song or your favorite modern rock song or your favorite song in general from any artist, and what are the loudest parts of that song? A lot of the times in today's pop music, that's going to be the vocals. In dance music, oftentimes it's going to be the kick drum or the synths. So knowing what you're focusing around is a huge factor in making sure that the mix sounds the way you want it to. And one of the best things you can do is use one of those tracks that you like listening to as a reference track. And then one huge thing to emphasize with volume, with all of these controls at your disposal, is that the focal point can change during the song. Maybe the vocal is the primary element throughout the song, but maybe there's an instrumental bridge, and all of a sudden an instrument becomes the focal point, and that vocal takes a back seat. It's not a set and forget kind of situation. So you have to use the vision of the song and figure out for each part, at each section of the song, what am I focusing on, and how can I make sure to accentuate that part? So along the lines of volume, but it accomplishes its separate task, is panning. So while volume is up or down, increasing the volume or decreasing the volume, panning is adjusting in a stereo output left and right. Obviously, if a track is in mono, it's only going to come down one center channel and everything is going to be panned dead center. But in a lot of today's music, you're working with stereo tracks, so you have the whole spectrum going left to right. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to put the focal points right in the center of the song. It allows you to put backing vocals or backing instruments off to the sides a little bit, and it adds a little more clarity and a lot more emphasis for those focal points. The listener can also become more immersed in your song. Now, the first 2 elements I mentioned are part of the static mix, so this is a mix that you adjust without adding any plugins whatsoever. Now we get into the plugins. So the first plugin I want to emphasize is EQ, and at its very core, EQ is just a very smart volume tool. So instead of adjusting the volume of the entire track all at once, you can enhance certain frequencies, you can cut out certain frequencies, you can go in and make with surgical precision if you need to, or with a broader bass, and you have at your control just how much you want to emphasize or dial back. In addition to that, you can also use EQ tools like filters to completely cut out certain frequencies in the spectral range. EQ is also very good for creating more space between instruments, especially instruments that clash in the same frequency ranges. When you're using an EQ, you want to make sure you use both subtractive and additive. Additive is very important because you can enhance those frequencies you like with certain instruments, but subtractive is also important too because sometimes when you're capturing an audio source like a vocal or an instrument, you might get certain frequencies that are very harsh that you might not want in your final product. Now, often discussed at the same level of importance as EQ is compression. So compression, again, is another smart volume tool. What compression does is if the audio signal hits above a certain value, the compressor is going to kick in and it's going to reduce that audio signal by a certain amount that you set in the compressor. Now, why do we want to do this? While we're trying to capture the best take from our audio sources as possible, there's always going to be a dynamic range. Think of a vocalist, for example, when they're singing a loud part of a song or a quiet part of a song. Sometimes in the louder parts, they might get too loud and harsh and they need to be dialed back, and we can use a compressor to do that. In addition to that, a compressor also boosts the floor of the sound, so the very quiet parts are now getting boosted just a little bit by the compressor. So this works in 2 ways, and it essentially takes your very dynamic performance and helps to close it up just a little bit. So aside from taming the loudest peaks of our audio sources, a compressor is great for adding presence too. Almost every vocal in modern music today is compressed at some point, and that compression helps to bring a level of presence so that your ears focus on the source. Now, the last main tool that professionals use, or I should say category, and that's effects. There are a vast number of effects that you can use: choruses, flangers, all types of distortion. The effects I want to focus on are what are often used in today's modern music, and that's reverb and delay. So we talked about volume being up and down, and we talked about panning being left and right. But what reverb and delay do is they give a three-dimensional image to your sound. And what I mean by that is if you have a long delay on an audio source, then what it sounds like is that audio source is very far away. If you have a short delay, it sounds like the audio source is close. Same with reverbs. A small reverb means that the audio source is close. A large reverb makes it sound like the audio source is farther away in a larger room. Now, these can be used across all of your instruments, and you might even adjust the levels of them as you go throughout the song. Now, one thing I want to emphasize with all of these tools, especially with the plugins, you don't want to overuse any one piece, but also don't be afraid to use a drastic amount when your song calls for it. Some people are afraid to boost EQs 6 dB, 12 dB, but if the song calls for it, depending on the audio source that you brought in or the frequencies you're trying to emphasize, then use it. Use your ears. Listen to what sounds good. Same with compressors. There's a ridiculous amount of compression in modern music today, so you don't want to be shy there as well. I would caution about using too much reverb. Oftentimes when you're using reverb, especially on a focal point like a main vocal, it tends to sit that vocal farther back in the mix, taking away clarity, taking away emphasis, and taking away presence. Basically doing the opposite of what you were trying to achieve with that reverb, unless you want it to sound more atmospheric and cool like that. Now, we talked about the 5 main tools, but I want to talk about one bonus tool, and that's automation. Now, automation isn't its own setting or its own plugin. Automation can be used on anything that we discussed, from volume and panning to most of the parameters on any of the plugins that you add. Let's say you have a high-pass filter on an EQ. You can automate that high-pass filter to cut out more frequencies at a certain part of the song and then dial it back later in the song. Or for example, you could use automation to automate the volume. If you want to have the volume of your vocals sit very well throughout the entire mix, then you can automate the volume so that instead of the levels of the vocals being extremely dynamic, you still have that performance, but now you have the volume at one steady level. And then maybe as you come into choruses or you come into the bridge, you enhance that level a little bit. And then automation can also be used on effects. You can use automation to dial in effect, to bring back an effect. You could completely turn an effect on or off. So automation is a very worthwhile tool to learn and master, but it certainly comes after the 5 essential tools that I covered on earlier in this video. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm going to share a link to my 7 Steps to a Pro Mix guide. So be sure to click on the link here. And you can use this as a reference as you're mixing your songs so that you go through each step, making sure you're following the correct process and making sure you're focusing on the correct elements so that you get a great sounding mix. So with all the tools I've discussed, you'll be able to bring clarity and balance to your mixes, but you'll also be able to invoke emotion and emphasize the focal points of your song. And most importantly, it's going to be an entertaining and pleasing experience for your listeners so that they want to come back and listen to more of your music. And with that said, the Ultimate Mixdown is going to come out with a mixing start to finish series. Be sure to check that out. We'll go through all of these 5 points and more in detail in all of those videos. If this video helped you, tell your friends, hit the like button. Be sure to subscribe because we've got those mixing videos coming out. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.